In 2008, anthropologist Lee Berger made a groundbreaking discovery at Malapa Cave near Johannesburg, South Africa, the fossils of Australopithecus Sediba. Since then, he's been determined to prove that Sediba, which means wellspring, is a direct ancestor of humans. However, when initial studies were published in 2010 and 2011 in Science, fellow scientists had mixed reactions. Even the famous replica of Sediba's skull, Karabo, ended up tucked away in a side hallway at London's Natural History Museum, far from the main human evolution exhibit. Now, with a new round of research released in 2013, the question remains: could Sediba finally dethrone the iconic Lucy as our earliest known ancestor? The image, created by Lee Berger and the University of the Witwatersrand, was featured in Science and showcases their interpretation of Australopithecus sediba's unique gait. In the center of a striking display, flanked by a human skeleton on one side and a chimp skeleton on the other, stands a reconstructed model of Australopithecus sediba. The light gray sections show where scientists had to fill in missing parts. Berger's research team was determined to prove Sediba walked upright, but faced challenges because many of its anatomical features didn't quite fit with bipedal movement. To make it work, they envisioned a unique, swaying, almost awkward walk. Completely different from how humans move and unlike anything we've seen in any living or extinct species. The newly analyzed Australopithecus Sediba fossils, featured in 6 recent articles published in Science, include bones from a headless adult female, a young male, and a lone tibia, shin bone. Among the articles, there's an introductory piece by Lee Berger, titled The Mosaic Nature of Australopithecus Sediba, and an editorial by Anne Gibbons called A Human Smile and Funny Walk for Australopithecus Sediba. Each article dives into different aspects, like the mandible, teeth, chest, spine, and limbs. While some experts argue that Australopithecus africanus and Australopithecus sediba are the same species, these studies suggest Sediba was similar but distinct from Africanus. Using descriptions from Berger and Gibbons, it seems that when Sediba sashayed across ancient landscapes with her unique, almost swag-like gait, she may have shuffled the understanding of Australopithecine diversity. But did she also carry the seeds of human evolution? Berger's team believes so, arguing that Sediba displayed a mix of traits, many of which are distinctly human, placing her firmly in the line of our earliest ancestors. Berger points out that the challenge in determining where Australopithecus sediba fits on the human evolutionary tree comes from the incomplete fossil record. However, his team believes that Sediba shows more similarities to early Homo species than any other fossils, leading Berger to confidently claim that South Africa has provided the answer to the search for humanity's missing evolutionary link. In fact, he named the male fossil Karabo, which means the answer, when it was first revealed in 2011. We're seeing something extraordinary, a much more complete view of an early hominin species compared to the usual tiny fragments we've had to work with, says Berger, highlighting the well-preserved hand, leg, and skull of Sediba. He believes this provides an unprecedented look into the anatomy and evolutionary position of an early human ancestor. Berger's team describes Sediba as a mosaic of traits, blending features from both apes and early humans. This mix sets it apart from other Australopiths and early Homo species. He suggests that these findings could reshape our understanding of how early human ancestors evolved and how we interpret other, less complete fossils. For example, Berger notes that Sediba's jaw anatomy hints that it, and possibly Australopithecus africanus, may not have evolved from Australopithecus afarensis, the species of the famous Lucy fossil. We thought we understood this part of human evolution, but Sediba presents a new possibility, he says. Daryl J. DeRuyter, lead author of the mandible study, adds that Sediba is unique in size, shape, and growth patterns, though it shares features with both earlier Australopiths and later humans like Homo erectus. He describes Sediba as a transitional species between Australopiths and early humans, looking more like Homo than any other Australopith ever discovered, supporting Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Although the fossil record is still incomplete, De Ruyter is convinced that Sediba could be the ancestor of the Homo genus, or at least a close relative. The latest studies build on the controversial conclusions drawn in 2011, which suggested that Sediba had both human-like and ape-like traits. For instance, Sediba's hand was described as Homo-like, but on closer inspection, its long thumb and short fingers made it better suited for climbing trees than for making tools, something not found with Sediba fossils. As paleoanthropologist William Jungers pointed out, it's an Australopithecine hand in all important aspects, and wasn't capable of advanced human-like manipulation. Despite this, Berger's team continues to argue that Sediba is a blend of human and ape features. The arm and shoulder structure, perfectly adapted for tree swinging, further supports the idea that Sediba hadn't fully transitioned to living on the ground. Berger concludes that while the hand skeleton shows some human-like traits, Sediba's upper limbs are still largely primitive, ideal for climbing and possibly hanging, more so than previously thought for Australopiths. Unsurprisingly, a big focus in this special science issue on Australopithecus Sediba is figuring out how Sediba walked. Like with Lucy, walking on two legs, which is called bipedalism, is key for any ape-like species to be considered part of the human evolutionary story. As researchers point out, bipedalism has traditionally been regarded as the fundamental adaptation that sets hominids apart from other primates. But it's not just about walking upright briefly like modern primates can. It's about having the anatomy for sustained, regular bipedal movement. While a small brain, like Sediba's, can be overlooked in an early human ancestor, the ability to walk on two legs habitually is essential to securing a spot in our evolutionary lineage. That's where Sediba runs into trouble. Berger's team has long claimed that Australopithecus Sediba walked upright, largely based on reconstructed pelvic parts. However, new findings in science raise serious doubts. Many features of Sediba's anatomy suggest it wasn't well suited for bipedal walking. To explain the inconsistencies, researchers now suggest that if Sediba did walk on two legs, it did so in a unique, awkward way, unlike any other known species, living or extinct, and nothing like how humans walk. One major issue is the heel. Sediba's heel wasn't flat enough to provide a stable base for walking. Imagine trying to walk in ice skates. You'd wobble and struggle to stay upright. That's similar to what Sediba would have experienced, as its foot structure didn't provide the stable foundation needed for bipedal walking. Since Berger's team revealed that Sediba's heel was exquisitely small, twisted, and pointed like a chimp's, experts have questioned how it could have possibly walked upright. To account for this, researchers suggest Sediba may have had to strike the ground with the side of its foot and roll inward, an awkward movement known as hyperpronation. In humans, we normally pronate, the foot after the heel hits the ground, allowing us to absorb stress and adjust to uneven surfaces. However, hyperpronation is when this movement continues too far into the step, making walking less efficient. Berger's team believes Sediba might have used this unusual method to get around on 2 feet. This idea of a hyperpronating gait, which paleontologist Brian Richmond calls provocative, would put a lot of strain on key parts of the body like the lower back, knees, and muscles that cross both the knee and hip joints. Richmond and others speculate whether this odd way of walking was common for Australopithecus Sediba, or if it could have been caused by an injury in this particular individual. The fossil does show signs of stress near the knee, which the researchers take as evidence that this unusual gait was typical for Sediba. They suggest it points to a wide variety of walking styles in early human ancestors. However, this bone growth could just as easily indicate chronic stress from an unnatural, awkward walk, potentially in an injured animal. Importantly, there's nothing here that clearly shows an evolutionary shift away from ape-like traits. To avoid falling over while using a hyperpronating gait, Sediba would likely have had to shift its center of gravity backward, leading to a compensatory hyperlordosis, an exaggerated curve, in the lower back. Interestingly, Sediba's lowest lumbar vertebra is shaped in a way that suggests it might have had a lumbar curve. In humans, this curve, known as lumbar lordosis, helps us keep our balance by aligning our center of gravity over our hips. The researchers believe Sediba probably had 5 or possibly 6 lumbar vertebrae, similar to humans, who typically have 5. But despite popular belief, the ability to develop a lumbar curve doesn't rely heavily on the number of vertebrae. Great apes, for example, have only 3 or 4 lumbar vertebrae, yet some, like gorillas, can develop a curve if they walk upright in an awkward, unnatural way. Dissections have shown that this curve can result from changes in the shape of the discs between vertebrae, likely an adaptation to behavior, rather than a genetic trait. On the other hand, gibbons and Old World monkeys, who have 6 or 7 lumbar vertebrae, don't develop this curve at all. More important than the number of vertebrae in supporting the claim of Sediba's bipedalism is the strongly wedged last lumbar vertebra. Researchers argue that this extreme wedging in the lower spine shows Sediba had a lumbar curve, lordosis, adapted for upright posture and walking on 2 legs. However, the wedging in Sediba's lower vertebrae is actually far more pronounced than what's typically seen in humans. The angle of the lowest vertebra, presumably L5, is 10.9 degrees, far steeper than any other known Australopithecus specimen and rarely seen in humans. Additionally, the Sediba pelvis seems to have been tilted much more forward than in humans, and the lumbar section of its spine was longer, more flexible, and far more mobile. This suggests that Sediba's anatomy wasn't suited for stable bipedal walking like humans, but may have been designed for something completely different. If this individual tried walking upright when it wasn't swinging through trees, it likely placed a lot of stress on its bones and joints. Interestingly, further analysis of the upper limbs and shoulder shows that Sediba was well adapted for climbing trees or navigating rocky terrain, much like modern apes. Despite the focus on Sediba's so-called mosaic anatomy, highlighting subtle human-like traits as evidence of a transitional phase toward humanity, the latest studies mainly reinforce the idea that Australopithecus Sediba was still very much an ape. It may have been a different species from other Australopithecines, but it wasn't on a clear path to becoming human. For example, the conclusions drawn from the mandible and teeth study were based on characteristics that vary widely and relied on subjective, non-measurable traits. Even Bernard Wood, a paleoanthropologist from George Washington University, admitted, "Without more information, I don't know whether this is something I'd bet $50 or $500 on." Similarly, paleontologist William Kimball, an expert on Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy, pointed out that these differences in tooth crowns are minor, and applying them to fossils, millions of years old, is highly problematic. One of the key signs that Sediba was still essentially ape-like can be seen in its chest. The upper thorax had a conical shape, similar to modern apes, which is not ideal for bipedal walking. This shape restricts the kind of chest rotation needed for efficient walking on 2 legs. The researchers did note one unusual feature. A fragment of a lower rib was more slender than those above it, unlike modern apes, which have thicker lower ribs. They suggested this could be an evolutionary step toward the narrower human waist. However, they also observed that this rib had been pulled by muscles attached to the lower back, which, as discussed earlier, was highly unique in Sediba, but not human-like. The upper thorax's conical shape doesn't allow for proper arm swinging, a critical component of bipedal walking. The researchers noted that the shape of the thorax and position of the shoulder blades directly affect how the arms move to balance the body during walking. This led them to conclude that, based on its chest, shoulder, and foot anatomy, Sediba couldn't have walked with a typical bipedal gait. Anne Gibbons, writing on these new studies, remarked that Australopithecus Sediba could challenge Lucy's position as the most likely ancestor of the Homo genus. However, she called this a radical view. Many evolutionary paleontologists disagree with the idea that Sediba predates other early human ancestors. For example, the Homo fossil AL66661 is dated to 233 million years old, while Sediba is estimated at just under 2 million years. As Brian Richmond from George Washington University explained, that makes Sediba too late to the party to be the ancestor of Homo. Furthermore, other scientists have raised questions about the methodology and traits used to argue that Sediba had a mix of human and ape characteristics. Let's take it a step further. There's actually no concrete evidence proving that humans evolved from ape-like ancestors. Researchers studying Sediba or Lucy often start with the assumption that humans must have evolved from simpler, ape-like creatures, and then interpret any mixed traits as signs of evolutionary change. But if we set aside the assumption that humans only exist because of evolution from simpler forms, we can see that the variations among apes, including extinct ones like the Australopithecines, show diversity within the ape family, but not necessarily evidence of evolution. As evolutionary paleoanthropologist William Kimball points out, the discoveries of early hominids from 2 to 3 million years ago just add more layers to our understanding of ape diversity, without proving an evolutionary link. For example, researchers are adamant that Sediba walked upright, even though they have to propose an awkward and inefficient gait to make this work. Despite anatomical evidence from the shoulder, chest, and feet suggesting Sediba didn't walk upright, the insistence on this idea comes from a belief that ape-like ancestors gradually evolved to become complex humans. Much of the research focuses on how this could have happened, but no objective evidence has been found to prove it. Studies often identify traits shared among vertebrates and use them to suggest a scenario of human evolution from ape-like ancestors. However, these shared traits might actually point to a common designer, like a creator god, who made all living things with similar features. According to Genesis, living things were created to reproduce after their own kinds, showing variation within those kinds, but not evolving into entirely new, complex kinds.
Australopithecus Sediba does show some differences from modern apes, and it shares many traits with Australopithecus africanus, but it also has enough unique features to be considered a different species. This research shows diversity among apes, but doesn't provide proof of evolution or human ancestry. What it does reveal is the strong inclination of evolutionists to interpret the data in a way that fits their pre-existing beliefs.